was all to do with my wife, Joycey. She was my biggest fan, and she took...
The world knew Ronnie Milsap as the blind country superstar who could do anything. He won Grammys, topped charts, and made it look easy. But what fans didn't know was that behind every smile, every performance, every award, he was living two completely separate lives. For 30 years, the truth stayed hidden, locked away where nobody could find it. His closest friends didn't see it. His family didn't talk about it. Even now, it's hard to believe. What secret did Ronnie Milsap carry for so long? And why is the truth only coming out now? Join us as we reveal the double life nobody knew existed. The opening paradox. Ronnie Milsap, a name that dominated country music for decades, a voice that could shatter hearts with a single note, a man who stood at the center of Nashville's most glittering era. 40 #1 hits, 6 Grammy Awards, countless nights when arenas filled with thousands who came to hear him sing about love, loss, and the kind of longing that country music does so well. On stage, he was untouchable, a force of nature wrapped in rhinestones and confidence. But behind that image, behind the smile that never wavered and the voice that never cracked, Ronnie Milsap lived a life split clean down the middle. One half belonged to the world, the other half remained hidden, locked away in a darkness no spotlight could ever reach. What makes Ronnie Milsap's story different from the usual tales of fame and fortune is not the success itself, but what that success concealed. He was born blind, almost completely, into a world that had no place for him. Abandoned at birth by a mother who could not bear to raise a child she saw as broken. Sent away at 5 years old to an institution where survival meant learning to move through a world designed to exclude him. And yet, from that beginning, he became one of the most successful country artists of all time. A man who refused to let blindness define him, even as it shaped every single day of his life in ways the public never saw. The double life Ronnie Milsap lived was not about scandal or secret affairs. It was about the distance between what people believed they were seeing and what was actually happening. On one side, a superstar who made everything look effortless, who navigated stages and studios with the ease of someone who had never known limitation. On the other side, a man who lived with constant anxiety, who had to memorize every step, every doorway, every piece of equipment just to function. A man who spent decades pretending that blindness was no obstacle, because admitting otherwise would have meant losing everything he had fought to build. This is not a story about triumph over adversity in the way we like to package those stories, clean and inspirational, with a beginning, middle, and happy ending. This is a story about the cost of that triumph, about marriages that fell apart because there was no room left for intimacy, when every ounce of energy went into maintaining the image. About a son who grew up watching his father become a legend while barely knowing the man. About the exhaustion of living two lives at once, the public one polished to perfection, the private one barely held together by sheer will. Ronnie Milsap is still alive today, still performing at 81 years old in 2025, still standing on stages where most people his age have long since retired. But what he carries with him is not just a legacy of hits and awards. It is the weight of everything he had to sacrifice, everything he had to hide, everything he had to endure in silence so that the world could keep believing in the version of him they wanted to see. And it is only now, when the lights have dimmed and the machinery of fame has slowed, that the truth about what it cost him can finally be spoken aloud. Abandoned into darkness. Ronnie Lee Milsap was born on January 16, 1943, in Robbinsville, North Carolina, a small town tucked deep into the Smoky Mountains, where poverty was not an exception but a way of life. He arrived into the world almost completely blind, a condition caused by a congenital disorder that left him with only the faintest perception of light and shadow. His mother took one look at him and made a decision that would define the rest of his life. She decided that she could not raise him. She would not raise him. Within days, Ronnie was handed over to his grandparents, Homer and Phinia Milsap, who lived in a rural area so isolated that the nearest neighbor was miles away. The abandonment was not loud or dramatic. It was simply a fact. His mother walked away, and Ronnie grew up knowing that the first person who should have loved him had chosen not to. His grandparents were not cruel, but they were old, poor, and unprepared to raise a blind child. They did what they could, but there was no tenderness, no softness, only the hard rhythm of survival. Ronnie learned early to stay out of the way, to move carefully through a house where no one had time to guide him, to listen more than speak, because speaking only reminded everyone of the burden he represented. The world Ronnie grew up in was one of silence and distance. No schools nearby that would accept a blind child, no medical care that could offer hope, no future that anyone could imagine for him. His grandparents' small farm was his entire universe. And within that universe, Ronnie learned to navigate by sound. The creak of a floorboard, the slam of a screen door, the rustle of wind through trees. Sound became his map, his guide, the only reliable thing in a world that offered him nothing else. At age 5, that world was ripped away. His grandparents could no longer manage, and Ronnie was sent to the Governor Moorhead School for the Blind in Raleigh, over 200 miles from the only home he had ever known. The school was an institution, not a family. Cold, regimented, built on the belief that blind children needed to be trained, controlled, and kept separate from the seeing world. Ronnie was placed in a dormitory with other blind children, taught to read Braille, taught to move in straight lines, taught that independence was a privilege earned through obedience. It was in that institution, surrounded by other children who had also been discarded, that Ronnie first encountered a piano. The moment his fingers touched the keys, something shifted. Music did not require sight. It did not require permission. It flowed out of him naturally, instinctively, as if it had been waiting inside him all along. For the first time in his life, Ronnie Milsap found something he could control, something that belonged to him alone. Music became his refuge, his language, and eventually his only way out. The forbidden path. The Governor Moorhead School wanted Ronnie Milsap to become a lawyer or a classical pianist. Those were the acceptable paths for a blind boy with intelligence and talent. Safe, respectable, contained. The instructors drilled him in classical technique, hour after hour at the piano, teaching him to read Braille sheet music, to memorize complex compositions, to perform with the precision expected of someone who would spend his life proving he was just as capable as the sighted world. Ronnie learned everything they taught him, and he excelled. But late at night, when the dormitories went quiet and the staff stopped patrolling the halls, he slipped away to the music room and played something entirely different. Rock and roll, rhythm and blues. The raw, unpolished sounds coming through the radio from stations his teachers would never approve of. Little Richard, Ray Charles, Jerry Lee Lewis. Voices that did not ask permission, that broke rules, that made music feel like freedom instead of discipline. Ronnie taught himself by ear, finding the chords, the rhythms, the feeling behind the notes. When Ronnie graduated, the pressure intensified. He was offered a scholarship to Young Harris College to study law. His teachers, his grandparents, everyone who had invested in shaping his future expected him to accept. Law was stable, dignified, a career where blindness could be managed within controlled environments. But Ronnie could not silence the other pull, the one that had been growing louder since those secret nights at the piano. Music was not a hobby. It was the only thing that made him feel alive. The decision to walk away was not dramatic. There was no grand announcement, no public rebellion. Ronnie simply chose a different direction, one that led him away from the approved path and toward the uncertain, dangerous world of performing. He formed a band, played fraternity parties, small clubs, anywhere that would let him on stage. The money was terrible, the audiences were drunk and indifferent, and every performance was a gamble. But for the first time, Ronnie was not following someone else's plan. He was building his own. In 1965, Ronnie married Joyce Reeves, a young woman who believed in him when almost no one else did. They moved to Memphis, chasing session work, studio gigs, anything that kept music at the center of his life. Memphis in the mid-60s was a crucible, the place where rock, soul, and country collided. Ronnie played on sessions with musicians who had backed Elvis, learned the craft in smoke-filled rooms where mistakes were not tolerated. The work was grueling, the pay barely enough to survive. But Ronnie was learning, absorbing, becoming something more than the blind boy who was supposed to follow the rules. What he did not yet understand was that choosing music meant choosing a life where stability would always be fragile, where relationships would bend under the weight of ambition, and where every step forward would cost him something he could never get back. Nashville and the first fracture. By 1973, Ronnie Milsap had spent nearly a decade grinding through the Memphis music scene with little to show for it, beyond exhaustion and a growing sense that time was running out. He was 30 years old, married to Joyce, and still chasing a breakthrough that seemed to recede further with every failed opportunity. The decision to move to Nashville was not born of confidence, but desperation. Country music felt like the last door left to knock on, the final chance to prove that all those years of refusing the safe path had been worth something. Nashville did not welcome him with open arms. The industry looked at a blind musician trying to cross over from rock and R&B into country and saw risk, complication, something too difficult to market. But then came Pure Love, a song that shot straight to #1 on the country charts and changed everything overnight. Suddenly, Ronnie Milsap was not a struggling session player. He was a star. Record deals followed, studio sessions, television appearances, and the kind of attention that had seemed impossible just months earlier. The success was immediate and overwhelming. Ronnie became country music's first blind superstar, a novelty that the industry did not quite know how to handle. Reporters asked constantly about his blindness, framing every achievement as a triumph over disability rather than simply recognizing his talent. Ronnie learned quickly to deflect, to minimize, to make it seem like blindness was no obstacle at all. The public wanted to see him as inspirational, not vulnerable, and so he gave them what they wanted: confidence, charm, and a voice that could sell records by the millions. Behind that polished image, the marriage to Joyce was coming apart. The years of financial struggle had strained the relationship, but success did not repair what poverty had broken. It only exposed new fractures. Ronnie was never home, always on the road, always in the studio, always chasing the next hit because stopping meant risking everything he had just gained. Joyce had supported him through the lean years, believed in him when no one else would, but now she was left alone while her husband became a household name. There were no dramatic fights, no public scandals. The marriage simply dissolved through accumulated absence, through the realization that Ronnie had chosen music over everything else, including her. In 1975, they divorced quietly. The press barely noticed. Ronnie was already too famous for a failed marriage to slow him down, and he did not allow himself time to grieve. Instead, he met Joyce Todd, a woman who entered his life at the exact moment when he needed someone who understood the machinery of fame. They married quickly, and Ronnie adopted her son, Todd, becoming a father in the middle of a career that was accelerating beyond his control. What Ronnie did not yet understand was that the same pattern would repeat. The same choice between family and music, the same slow erosion of everything that was not directly tied to success. The first fracture had already formed, and it would only widen from here. The machine of success. After the divorce from Joyce Reeves and the rapid remarriage to Joyce Todd, Ronnie Milsap entered a period where success was no longer a goal, but a relentless machine that consumed everything in its path. The late 1970s and early 1980s belonged to him in a way few artists ever experience. Chart after chart, hit after hit, awards piling up so fast there was barely time to acknowledge them before the next album cycle began. It was almost like a song, Smoky Mountain Rain, Any Day Now, There's No Getting Over Me. Each song climbed to #1, each performance sold out arenas, and each year reinforced that Ronnie Milsap was no longer just a star. He was an institution. The industry celebrated him as proof that country music could evolve, that it could absorb influences from pop, rock, and R&B without losing its soul. Ronnie's blindness, once seen as a liability, became part of his brand. Inspirational, triumphant, a man who had overcome impossible odds. The narrative was polished, repeated in every interview, every television appearance, every award acceptance speech. And Ronnie played his part perfectly. Never complaining, never showing weakness, always gracious, always professional. But the machinery of success demanded constant feeding, touring schedules that stretched across months with barely a day off, recording sessions that ran through the night because studio time was expensive and expectations were high, television specials, radio interviews, photo shoots, meet and greets. Ronnie had to be everywhere, all the time, maintaining the image of effortless success while privately navigating a world built for people who could see. Technology helped, but it also isolated him. Braille notes, assistants who guided him through unfamiliar spaces, elaborate systems to manage what others took for granted. He lived in a world of voices, textures, and routines that could not be disrupted without throwing everything into chaos. The exhaustion was not just physical, it was the mental load of holding an entire invisible architecture in his mind while making it look like none of it was necessary. At home, Joyce Todd managed the household, raised Todd, and tried to create stability in a life that had none. Ronnie was present in name, but absent in practice. He loved his family, or at least he believed he did, but love required time, attention, presence. And those were luxuries the machine did not allow. Every moment not spent performing or recording felt like wasted potential, like a crack in the armor that could let doubt seep in. So, Ronnie kept moving, kept working, kept feeding the machine because stopping meant confronting what he had already lost. By the mid-1980s, Ronnie Milsap had 40 #1 hits, 6 Grammy Awards, and a career that defined an era. But the cost was accumulating in places the public could not see. In the silence of hotel rooms after the crowds went home. In the distance growing between him and his wife. In the son who was learning that being Ronnie Milsap's child meant living in the margins of someone else's legend. The secret weight. Living with blindness in an industry built entirely on image required Ronnie Milsap to perform 2 roles simultaneously. The public one, where everything was effortless, and the private one, where every single day was a calculated negotiation with a world designed to exclude him. The accommodation was constant, invisible, and exhausting. Before every concert, Ronnie had to walk the stage in the afternoon, memorizing the exact number of steps from the piano to the microphone, where the monitor wedges were positioned, where the stage ended and the drop began. One miscalculation could mean a fall in front of thousands of people, and a fall would shatter the illusion of competence he had spent years constructing. In the studio, Ronnie could not see the engineer's hand signals, could not read the body language of musicians waiting for a cue, could not glance at sheet music if he forgot a line. Everything had to be memorized, internalized, held in his mind with perfect clarity because hesitation would be read as weakness. He developed systems, routines that became rituals. His band knew never to move equipment without telling him. His engineers learned to describe technical problems in language he could translate into action. His assistants guided him through airports, hotels, and venues with a choreography so smooth it looked like Ronnie was navigating on his own. Every dinner in an unfamiliar restaurant meant discreetly asking where the food was positioned on the plate, cutting carefully to avoid looking clumsy, engaging in conversation while monitoring the location of his glass so he would not knock it over. These were small things, invisible to everyone else, but they accumulated into a constant low-level anxiety that never entirely went away. At home, the weight settled differently. Joyce Todd had married a man on the verge of stardom and found herself managing a life that revolved entirely around his needs. She became his navigator, his organizer, the person who ensured that the household ran smoothly so Ronnie could focus on his career. It was not a partnership of equals. It was a structure where one person's ambition consumed all available oxygen, and everyone else learned to breathe in the leftover space. Todd, Ronnie's adopted son, grew up watching his father receive applause from strangers while barely being present for the small moments that build a childhood. Baseball games missed because of tour dates, school events skipped because of recording sessions. A father who was famous to the world but distant at home? Ronnie did not see it happening, not because of blindness, but because success had trained him to prioritize the public over the private. Every choice reinforced the same pattern. The career came first because the career was fragile. He believed the family would understand. The family would still be there when the machine finally slowed down. But the truth was simpler and more brutal. When the center could not hold. By the late 1980s, Ronnie Milsap had been running at full speed for nearly 2 decades. The hits kept coming, the tours never stopped, and the awards continued to pile up in a storage room somewhere because there was no space left to display them. From the outside, everything looked exactly as it should. A legendary career, a stable marriage, a son growing into adulthood. But beneath that carefully maintained surface, fractures had been forming for years, quiet and persistent, waiting for the moment when the weight would become too much to bear. The second marriage, to Joyce Todd, had survived longer than the first, but survival was not the same as thriving. Joyce had spent years adapting her entire life around Ronnie's needs, managing schedules, coordinating travel, ensuring that every detail was handled so he could focus on performing. She had accepted that her role was not to be an equal partner, but to be the infrastructure that kept everything running. And for a long time, that acceptance had been enough. But acceptance eventually hardens into resignation, and resignation into a silent, accumulating resentment that neither person knows how to name. Ronnie was not cruel. He was not unfaithful in the traditional sense. But he was absent, and absence, stretched across years, creates its own kind of betrayal. He missed birthdays, anniversaries, ordinary evenings that could have been spent together, but were instead filled with sound checks, meet and greets, and the endless machinery of fame. When he was home, he was exhausted, depleted, with nothing left to give. Conversations became functional, logistical, intimacy became scheduled, another task on a list that never shortened. The marriage did not collapse in a dramatic explosion. It eroded slowly, like stone worn down by water, until what remained was a structure that looked intact but no longer had a foundation. Todd, meanwhile, was navigating adolescence and young adulthood in the shadow of a father who was everywhere and nowhere at once. He had been adopted into a ready-made identity, Ronnie Milsap's son, a role that came with expectations he had never chosen. People recognized the name, asked questions, assumed closeness that did not exist. Todd loved his father, but he also resented him, a contradiction he could not fully articulate even to himself. Ronnie had provided materially, ensured that Todd wanted for nothing, but presence cannot be replaced by provision. The moments that build a relationship, the conversations, the shared experiences, the simple act of being known, those had been sacrificed to the machine. Ronnie himself was beginning to feel the strain in ways he could not admit publicly. The country music landscape was shifting. New artists with new sounds were taking over the charts, and the formula that had worked for Ronnie in the 70s and 80s no longer guaranteed success. For a man who had defined himself entirely through success, the gradual fade was devastating. Ronnie had spent his entire life proving that blindness was not a limitation, that he could compete and win in a world built for the sighted. But now, the question was no longer whether he could succeed. It was whether success had been worth what it cost. And that question, once it took root, was impossible to ignore. The center could not hold because the center had been built on unsustainable terms. Something had to give, and it was only a matter of time before everything held together by will alone finally came apart. The legacy of survival. Ronnie Milsap is still alive in 2026, still performing at 81 years old, still climbing onto stages where most people his age have long since retired to quiet lives far from the spotlight. He moves slower now, his voice carries the texture of decades, and the hits that once dominated the charts are now considered classics, the kind of songs that define an era rather than shape the current moment. But he has not stopped. Stopping, for Ronnie, has never been an option. Music was the thing that saved him from an institution, from poverty, from a future that had been decided for him before he was old enough to resist. And even now, when there is nothing left to prove, he keeps returning to it, because it remains the only place where he has ever felt fully alive. The legacy Ronnie Milsap leaves behind is not simple. It cannot be reduced to the 40 #1 hits, the 6 Grammy Awards, the platinum records, or the induction into the Country Music Hall of Fame. Those achievements are real, documented, undeniable, but they tell only half the story. The other half exists in the spaces between the accolades, in the accumulated cost of a life lived entirely in service to ambition. Ronnie proved that a blind man could succeed in an industry that had no framework for him, that he could not only compete but dominate. He opened doors that had been locked, changed perceptions that had been rigid, and became a symbol of possibility for anyone who had been told their limitations were permanent. But that symbol required Ronnie to live a double life. One life belonged to the public, polished and triumphant, a narrative of overcoming that fit neatly into interviews and award speeches. The other life belonged to him alone, filled with the constant vigilance, the exhausting accommodation, the relationships sacrificed, and the loneliness that came from being seen but never truly known. Ronnie could not afford to let people see the struggle, because the struggle would have undermined the very thing that made him marketable. Inspiration requires the appearance of ease. Vulnerability is not something the public pays to witness. His marriages did not survive. The first ended in quiet dissolution, the second strained under years of absence until whatever had once held it together simply was not strong enough anymore. Todd, his son, grew up with a famous father, but without the father he needed, learning early that love and presence are not the same thing. Ronnie was not a bad man. He was not neglectful in the way that word is usually understood, but he was consumed, and consumption leaves little room for anything else. The people closest to him learned to exist in the margins, to take what they could get, to understand that Ronnie's attention would always be divided, and that music would always come first. Now, in the final stretch of his life, Ronnie Milsap performs not because he needs the money or the applause, but because stepping away would mean confronting the silence he has spent a lifetime avoiding. Music has been his refuge, his identity, his proof of worth. Without it, what remains? The question is not one he seems willing to answer, so he keeps moving, keeps singing, keeps standing on stages where the lights he cannot see still shine on a man who spent his entire life proving he belonged there. The double life Ronnie Milsap lived was not about deceit. It was about survival. It was about navigating a world that did not want to make space for him and forcing it to anyway, at a cost no one else could see. He became a legend, but legends are built from sacrifice, and the sacrifice is rarely evenly distributed. Ronnie gave everything to music, and music gave him everything in return, except the one thing he might have needed most: the ability to stop, to rest, to exist as something other than the man who refused to let blindness define him, even as it shaped every moment of his life. And perhaps that is the truest part of his legacy. Not the songs, not the awards, not the barriers broken, but the proof that survival itself, the act of continuing when everything inside you has been spent, can be its own quiet, relentless form of courage. Ronnie Milsap lived two lives, and both of them were real. One the world celebrated, the other he carried alone. And in 2026, he is still carrying it, still moving forward, because that is the only direction he has ever known how to go. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.